Welcome back, everyone. Ready for deep dive number 7.
Always ready to dive in.
This time, we're looking at Chinese state-sponsored cyber threats.
A fascinating and complex area.
Definitely. Our main source today is a report from Sequoia.io. They're a European cybersecurity firm.
And they really get into the nuances of this landscape, understanding this stuff. It's crucial these days.
Absolutely. It's not just about some data breach here or a stolen password there. This is big picture stuff.
Right. We're talking about understanding the motivations, the tactics of a major player on the global stage.
Exactly. And Sequoia.io uses this great phrase, a 3-beat waltz, to describe the Chinese cyber ecosystem.
Yeah, it's a really apt analogy because it highlights how the three main actors work together, or sometimes maybe not so together.
The PLA, the MSS, and the MPS.
Right. The People's Liberation Army, the Ministry of State Security, and the Ministry of Public Security. Each one has its own role to play, its own rhythm, but they all contribute to this larger, almost choreographed effort.
So let's start with the PLA. I mean, they've always been the big name in cyber espionage, right?
Historically, yeah. They were incredibly active, focused on intelligence gathering, disruption, you name it. But the report suggests that their activity might actually have decreased somewhat in recent years.
That's interesting. Why would that be?
Well, there are a few possible explanations. It could be that the PLA is shifting its focus towards more strategic targets, operating with more secrecy, or maybe even outsourcing some of their activities to private contractors.
So they're being a bit more subtle, maybe trying to fly under the radar.
Could be. We also have to consider those major reforms they underwent. Back in 2015, then again in 2024.
The Strategic Support Force.
The SSF. Right, the SSF. They created it to centralize all their cyber, space, and electronic warfare capabilities. But then, just a few years later, they dissolved it.
So maybe a bit of internal reorganization is affecting things.
Yeah, these changes, they definitely had some ripple effects on the PLA's cyber operations. It's not a simple picture.
So are they still a major player, or are they taking a backseat now?
I'd say they're still a major player, but maybe not always the one directly conducting the attacks anymore.
Right. So who is?
Well, Sequoia.io, they suggest that the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, might actually be a more accurate indicator of, what the Chinese Communist Party is really after these days.
So if we want to understand China's real goals, we should be looking at what the MSS is doing, not necessarily the PLA's movement.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. The MSS, they've been super active lately, targeting a much wider range of things globally. Governments, industries, you name it. Think about APT-40, APT-41, APT-31. Those are all linked back to the MSS.
Okay, back up a sec. APT groups, for those of us who don't live and breathe this stuff, what exactly are we talking about?
APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. Basically, these are highly sophisticated, well-funded groups, usually backed by a government. They're not just in it for some quick cash. They're playing the long game, espionage, stealing intellectual property, disrupting critical infrastructure, that kind of thing.
So the cyber equivalent of special forces.
Exactly. They're in it for the long haul. And they're really good at what they do. The MSS, they're known for using front companies to hide their activities, developing really advanced malware that's hard to detect.
That makes them pretty formidable then.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, so the PLA might be stepping back a bit. The MSS is stepping up. What about the third part of this, Waltz, the MPS?
Right, the Ministry of Public Security. They're more focused on what's happening inside China, targeting dissidents, activists, anyone they see as a threat, even if they've left the country.
Keeping things in line.
Yeah, basically. Now, you don't hear about them connected to specific APT groups as often as the MSS or the PLA.
Is that because they're more low-key, or?
Well, it could be because they're often targeting individuals rather than big organizations. Individuals are less likely to go public if they get attacked.
Makes sense. But the MPS isn't exactly invisible, are they?
Yeah.
What about those iSoon leaks? That was a pretty big deal, right?
Oh, yeah. The iSoon leaks were huge. They exposed a whole network of private companies that the MPS was using for their cyber operations.
So it's not just the government itself doing the hacking. They're outsourcing it.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. It really blurred the lines between, what's the government doing directly and what are these private companies up to.
So it's more complicated than just saying China is hacking us. It's a whole ecosystem.
Absolutely. We'll definitely get into that whole hack for hire thing more later. But first, I think it's important to understand where all this comes from.
Okay, where do we start?
Well, the report goes into this whole evolution of what they call patriotic hackers in China. That's where things get fascinating, in my opinion.
Patriotic hackers, huh? That sounds almost like a contradiction in terms. What does that even mean?
Oh, think about the early days of the internet in China. You had all these young, tech-savvy people really driven by nationalism, and they were engaging in what we might call hacktivism. They would target websites of, perceived enemies, deface them with pro-China messages, launch denial-of-service attacks, that kind of thing, basically using their skills to show their patriotic fervor.
So, like digital graffiti artists, but with a political agenda.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It was their way of showing loyalty, pushing back against what they saw as, Western dominance or hostility towards China.
Interesting. But the report says things started to change after 2002. What happened then?
The Chinese Communist Party, they realized what a valuable resource these skilled hackers could be, so they started to exert more control over them. Some got integrated into government agencies, the PLA or the MSS, for example.
Brought into the fold.
Right. Others got recruited by private companies that were getting more and more involved in these state-sponsored operations.
So it was either join them or what? Become a criminal.
It wasn't always that black and white, but there was definitely a shift towards, more organized, professionalized hacking activities. And to illustrate this transition, the report uses this great example. Tan Dalen, also known as Wicked Rose.
Wicked Rose. Wow, that does sound like something out of a spy movie.
It's a pretty interesting story. He started out as a university student, part of a hacktivist group called the Green Army.
Okay.
He was involved in those early denial-of-service attacks against the U.S. after the Hainan Island incident.
Right.
But then he got recruited by the PLA and later became associated with APT-41. Remember that MSS-linked group we talked about earlier?
Wow, so he went from, defacing websites as a student activist to developing serious malware for state-sponsored espionage.
That's right. Quite a career path, wouldn't you say?
Definitely.
And his story isn't unique. The report shows that a lot of these patriotic hackers followed similar paths, from hacktivism to professional roles within this whole Chinese cyber ecosystem.
So it sounds like they were given a choice. Use your skills for the state or risk becoming a target yourself.
Yeah, it might not have been that explicit, but the message was pretty clear. Align yourself with the CCP's objectives or else.
And Tan Dalen, Wicked Rose, he's the poster child for how that all played out.
I think that's a fair assessment. He's really a symbol of this whole evolution from amateur to, professional cyber operative.
And what a symbol he is.
Right. His story shows how China has been so effective at harnessing the skills, the enthusiasm of these individuals. They turn them into, a very valuable asset for their cyber operations.
Fascinating stuff.
It is, isn't it? And it gets even more complex from here.
I bet it does. But we'll have to save that for part 2.
It's not just about individual stories like Tan Dalen's, though.
All right.
The report, it shows how the tools, the actual techniques these patriotic hackers developed, they've spread throughout the whole Chinese cyber ecosystem.
Okay.
For example, malware like PlugX and ShadowPad.
I've heard of those.
Those were originally created by, guys like Tan Dalen.
Right.
And now they're being used by all sorts of Chinese APT groups.
Including those MSS-linked ones.
Exactly. So it's not just about stealing secrets anymore, is it?
No, the report talks about this blurring between patriotism and profit.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Some groups, they're laser focused on espionage, intelligence gathering.
Right.
But others, they seem to be after money. And sometimes it's the same group doing both.
Like APT-41.
Exactly. APT-41, they've been linked to both espionage campaigns and just straight-up financial crime.
So one day they're stealing government secrets, the next they're hitting a bank.
That's what we're seeing. And it really makes you wonder, how much control does the Chinese government actually have over these groups?
Right. Are they just turning a blind eye to the money-making schemes as long as they're targeting, non-Chinese entities?
Mm-hmm.
Or are they actively encouraging it?
It's a tough question. And it makes it even harder to figure out who's really behind these attacks.
And what their motives are.
Absolutely.
So the ISOON leaks, they didn't just expose the MPS using those private firms.
No, not at all.
It revealed a whole hack-for-hire industry operating in China.
That's right. It's a whole ecosystem.
So anyone with enough cash can just buy themselves some hacking services.
Seems that way. And we're not just talking about small-time operators here.
Yeah.
We're talking established companies, some of them even publicly traded, offering these services.
That's pretty shocking. Was the MPS their main client?
They were definitely a big customer.
Yeah.
But the leaks showed that the MSS and even the PLA, they were involved to some extent too.
It's not just a top-down thing. It's more like a I don't know, a web of relationships.
Exactly. Different players, all vying for influence, for profit, and that makes it even harder to figure out who did what.
A real attribution nightmare for cybersecurity professionals.
Definitely. And this whole hack for hire thing,
Right.
it goes even deeper than that. It's not just about stealing data or causing disruption. China is using it to weaponize vulnerabilities.
No, that sounds serious.
It is. The Asun leaks, they gave us a glimpse into this whole hack for hire world. But they also showed something even more worrying.
Which is,
How China is systematically exploiting vulnerabilities to develop, well, basically cyber weapons.
hold on, weaponizing vulnerabilities. What does that even mean?
Well, in 2021, China passed this law.
Okay.
It mandates that any vulnerability found in software, it has to be reported to the government.
So any security flaw anyone finds, it goes straight to the Chinese authorities.
That's the law.
At first glance, that might seem like a good idea, right? Finding a weakness and fixing it.
Sure, on the surface.
But the report suggests it's actually a very clever move by China.
It is, yeah. It's a double-edged sword.
How so?
It lets the Chinese government identify and patch vulnerabilities in software used in China.
So they can improve their own cybersecurity.
Exactly. But it also gives them this huge advantage when it comes to offense.
So they get a head start. They know about these flaws before anyone else.
Right. They can choose to disclose them or keep them secret.
And exploit them.
Exactly. It's like they're hoarding vulnerabilities, treating them like precious metals, to build up their cyber arsenal.
That's pretty strategic.
Very much so. Is it something other countries are doing? Maybe. But the scale of China's system and their lack of transparency, that's what makes it really concerning.
And they're actively encouraging people to find these vulnerabilities.
Right. With these hacking contests, bug bounty programs.
The Tianfu Cup, for example.
Exactly. It's like a sport over there.
They're gamifying the whole thing.
They are. It's a source of national pride. Talented hackers competing to find flaws in all sorts of software, hardware, big cash prizes, recognition, even job offers.
From, I'm guessing, government agencies and those private firms we talked about?
You got it. But here's the thing. What happens to all those vulnerabilities they find?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Some might get disclosed, sure, but others almost certainly are kept secret.
Added to that arsenal.
Exactly. And with that mandatory reporting law, there's no way to know for sure what happens to these vulnerabilities once they're reported.
It's a black box.
It is. We know they're finding these flaws, but what they do with them, that's anyone's guess, and that's what makes this whole thing so unsettling.
Makes you think twice about using any software or hardware from China, knowing it could have a backdoor built right in.
Right. It creates this atmosphere of distrust. It's a tough situation. What can other countries even do? It's a big geopolitical problem. No easy answers.
Yeah.
Some people say we need stricter controls on tech coming out of China.
Yeah.
Others say we need more international cooperation on cybersecurity, vulnerability disclosure.
Sounds like a bit of both might be needed.
Probably.
Yeah.
It's going to take governments, businesses, the whole international community to really tackle this.
A lot to unpack there.
Definitely. This is just scratching the surface, really.
I'm starting to see that.
The key takeaway here is that the lines are blurring. State-sponsored hacking, criminal activity, private companies doing their own thing. It's getting harder and harder to tell them apart.
And that makes defending against these threats
A whole lot harder, that's for sure.
So where do we go from here? I mean, it sounds like a pretty bleak picture.
Well, it's definitely complex, that's for sure.
Complex is one word for it.
But I wouldn't say it's hopeless.
Yeah.
The first step always is awareness.
Okay.
Understanding the threat, that's crucial. That's why reports like this one from Sequoia.io are so important.
Right, they give us that inside look.
Exactly. They help us understand the tactics, the motivations, the potential impact. Knowledge is power, right?
Right. But how do we turn that knowledge into action? What can we actually do to protect ourselves?
Well, there are a few things, regardless of whether you're an individual or a big company.
Okay.
First and foremost, good cyber hygiene. It sounds basic, but it's crucial. Keep your software updated, use strong passwords, watch out for phishing emails, back up your important data.
The stuff we hear all the time, but it's easy to forget.
It is, but it really can make a difference.
Yeah.
These basic security measures, they can prevent a lot of those common attacks.
But what about the more sophisticated stuff, like those APT groups we talked about?
Yeah.
How do you defend against that?
Well, that's where things get a bit more involved. You need to be proactive. Monitor your systems constantly, look for any unusual activity, and be ready to respond quickly if something does happen.
So it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing.
Not at all. You got to be vigilant, Always on the lookout.
And have a plan.
Exactly. If your systems get breached, what are you going to do? Who are you going to call? How are you going to recover your data?
There's like a lot of work. Is this something that only big organizations can handle? You know, the ones with dedicated cybersecurity teams and all that?
It can be tough, for sure. But there are resources out there to help smaller organizations, even individuals. Security software, online training, even government agencies that offer guidance and support.
So it's not impossible.
No, not at all. And remember, we're not alone in this. This is a global challenge. It's going to take international cooperation to really address it.
What does that look like in practice? International cooperation on cybersecurity.
Sharing information about threats, coordinating responses, working together to, set some ground rules for behavior in cyberspace.
So kind of like diplomacy, but for the digital world.
Exactly. And it's crucial. We can't just build walls around our own networks and pretend everything's fine. We need to work together to make the whole digital world more secure.
It's a shared responsibility then.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more we understand about this whole ecosystem, the better prepared we'll be.
Makes sense. Well, this has been an incredibly informative deep dive.
Glad to hear it.
Any final thoughts for our listeners out there? They might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this.
Don't panic. The first step is awareness, and you've already taken that by listening today. And remember, this is an ever-changing landscape. Things change fast in the cyber world. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and never underestimate how important cybersecurity is.
Great advice. A huge thank you to our expert for walking us through this fascinating and sometimes scary world of Chinese state-sponsored cyber threats.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk about this stuff.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something today. Stay curious, stay safe, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into a complex topic